Have you ever tried to make yourself look good and been humbled in the process? When I lived in Budapest like 20 some years ago, I was out for a walk with my best friend at the time. And as we were walking down the street, he saw some girl probably about 50 meters off and decided as she walked towards us that he wanted to look impressive. So he pulled out his phone, which wasn't a smartphone at the time, it was one of those old bar phones, and he decided that he was going to pretend to have a call where he looked really important. So he's saying, "Oh, I don't care what it takes. I want you in New York by Thursday." And I, being the good friend that I am, thought I'd have a little fun with him. So I reached into my pocket and I fingered the call button twice, because that's how you redialed on that phone. And he was the last call that I had made. And wouldn't you know it, just as we are approaching that girl that he's trying to impress, his phone rings. He turns and looks at it and sees my name in the call display. Let's just say it wasn't the most harmonious moment in our friendship. It's easy to seek to make much of ourselves, to make ourselves look impressive. But it's in humility that we find new life. Consider the Magi. Read with me in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time when the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another roll. So these Magi, we really don't have a word in English, so we just simply borrow the Greek one. They are astrologers, likely from Babylon or from Persia. They're the kinds of people who advise kings. They're courtiers, if you will. We can see that they're important because when they arrive in Jerusalem, Herod gives them an audience. If a regular old Joe showed up demanding an audience with the king, he'd just tell them to scram. So these astrologers have discerned through the signs and the stars that a king has been born to the Jewish people. That's kind of weird. It'd be like if someone walked into our church today and said, "Hey, I'm here because my horoscope told me to get right with Jesus." But in their world, important people live in palaces. And so when they find out that a king has been born to the Jews, they go to a palace in the Jewish capital. And that's where they would expect to find him. And so it must be kind of shocking when they find out that this new king doesn't live in the palace, and that the king only kind of knows where he might be. It pretty much tells you all you need to know about King Herod. Herod is not a legitimate king. Herod is a usurper, a Roman puppet who's only part Jewish and who has a rather tenuous connection to a less legitimate line of the king. Now, the previous chapter to what we just read is mostly a long genealogy of Jesus that shows how he is descended from King David. And so we understand already, if we've read this far in the gospel, that Jesus is the true king and Herod is the pretender. It's interesting because Jerusalem is the city of the kings, the capital, the place where important people are. And Jesus, this king who is to be born in Bethlehem, which calls to mind a similar kind of story, a time when God has done something the same. Israel's first king, Saul, was an impressive physical specimen, but he proved to be too big for his britches. And so God sends the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem, yes, Bethlehem, to the family of Jesse to anoint one of his sons as the next king. Samuel looks at Eliab and David's other older brothers and sees that they are physically imposing presences and assumes these must be the kings. One of these must be the king that God has anointed. But God says, no, I don't evaluate people the same way you do. And in the end, God leads Samuel to anoint David, the youngest and least impressive of Jesse's sons, as king. And it turns out that he becomes Israel's great king. Sometimes the important people aren't the people who are in the important places or who look important. This is how God operates. So, Herod sends these wise men off to Bethlehem, to the town of David, to find Jesus as unwitting accomplices in his attempt to destroy the Messiah. The star guides the wise men to the exact house where Jesus is, and when they get there, it must be something of a shocker. Now, we live in northern Ontario, and so if you ever use Google Maps, you're probably familiar with that feeling when you put in an address and Google says, you've arrived at your destination, and you're like, what? I was supposed to go to a hospital, and that's a cornfield. And so it must seem like that to them. Of course, they're using a star to navigate, but the star stops over a house, and it's not a fancy house. It's a regular old, unimportant people live there kind of house. The wise men might be thinking, I came to worship a king, and I get dropped off at a roach motel. What's this all about? I don't know why wise men would speak like that, but let's just assume that they do. And so the wise men are forced to make a choice. It's one thing to pay homage to a person who is notably better than you at something. But it's not the same when you're having to pay homage to someone who seems to be lesser than you. These are courtiers. They're used to bowing down to kings, but they're not used to bowing down to common folk. If I say, Stephen Hawking was smarter than me, everybody's like, yeah, no kidding. But if I say, oh, that guy at the counter at McDonald's is far smarter than me, well, that takes more humility, doesn't it? Because I'm lowering myself beneath somebody who seems low already. And so these wise men arrive and they see Jesus, a regular-looking baby in a regular kind of house, and they have to ask themselves, how low are they willing to go? How much are they willing to humble themselves to pay homage to this person that they've crossed many lands to see? But they choose to humble themselves. They choose to bow the knee to this baby. Now, this is especially remarkable because Babylon and Persia, the two countries that scholars think that they're probably from one of them, both had an opportunity to be Israel's oppressor in the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Babylonians, of course, took the Jews into exile, and the Persians are the ones who actually let them go back, but still were their pagan rulers. And so it's people who are outside of God's people. These are pagans. They would be considered enemies by Jews because they represent the pagan oppressors. And they choose to come and bend the knee in front of this humble king. And they are accepted. They find that if they humble themselves before the humble king, even as enemies of God's people, God accepts them as his people. We might say that these wise men are the first Gentile Christians. God brings new life to those who humble themselves before this humble king, even to his enemies. Are we willing to humble ourselves like the wise men humbled themselves? Our culture tells us that we are supposed to make much of ourselves. I remember when I was looking at job training stuff, that they were talking about how you need to make yourself indispensable at work. And of course, we all see how people are always trying to rack up credentials and degrees because they make them look more impressive. I want more things on my resume that make me stand out against the competition. We want to project an image. So social media allows us to create almost a personal brand that we sell to people that is often a sort of stylized picture of ourselves. But none of that is the way that Jesus operates. Jesus comes into the world as a humble person. He's born in a manger. He lives as a peasant. Jesus refuses the temptation of power. When Jesus is tempted by Satan in the wilderness, it says that Satan takes him to the temple. It says, why don't you throw yourself off? Because we both know that God's going to not let you die. He's going to send some angel to save you. Jesus, you look unimportant. But if you do this, everybody will see how important you are. Come on. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to do that. It's not who God is. God's not the person trying to make himself desperately look important. He has nothing to prove to anyone. He doesn't need to look important. He knows he's important, and so he can humble himself. And of course, Jesus' act of self-humbling keeps going lower and lower until you think he can't go any lower, and then the cross. The cross is a manner of execution that is one of the most ghastly and torturous that human beings have ever devised. But it is also a way of maximizing the humiliation of its victim. A person was beaten up to the point of almost being unrecognizable, forced to carry the crossbeam of the cross, the implement of their own death, through the town. They're stripped naked. I'm sorry, the loincloths in the Renaissance art are just there to keep things polite. And then they are nailed to that cross and displayed in public for days, typically, while they fight just to breathe and eventually succumb. It was the kind of execution that was designed to put people in their place. And so it was exercised on rebels, because no one would want to be associated with somebody who died such an awful and pathetic death, and yet Jesus does it. Jesus doesn't care what it makes him look like. The writer of Hebrews says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus is exalted because he humbles himself even to death. And God responds to Jesus' cross-shaped humility by pouring out on him resurrection life. Now, if we go back one verse beyond what I had put out in Hebrews, it says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. In other words, let's pattern our lives on Jesus, who humbles himself. And so as a consequence of his humbling, he experiences God's vindication through resurrection life. Now, for some of the early Christians, and Christians even today, this means physical suffering and even death. Most of the apostles and the first wave of sort of secondary apostles like Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Timothy and Apollos, most of them died violent deaths at the hands of other people. Not a common or expected end for people in our time and our place. But it certainly means that we are meant to reevaluate our sense of importance. And when we recalibrate glorious according to what Jesus did and who he was, then we will live a different kind of life. A life that doesn't seek to make more of ourselves, but a life that pours itself out for others, that feels no need to make much of ourselves, but is okay looking shameful. And it is in that kind of life that God will pour out his resurrection life. So what does it look like for God to pour out resurrection life on us? Now, in Christianity, we teach that we will live in unbroken fellowship with God, experiencing his peace and fellowship after the Lord returns. Resurrection life means that we can experience some measure of this reality on this side of eternity. But God only pours it out on us as we humble ourselves following Jesus' example. I know I've seen this at work. Have you ever been in a place where people can be free to be vulnerable without fear of rejection? When I first started in seminary, our first class was one where we all got together for a week at a retreat center. And the first day, they said, okay, we're going to introduce ourselves to each other and share our testimonies. And one of my classmates, a very brave guy, said, I'm going to go first because I think I need to. And over the next, 40 minutes or so, in unflinching detail, he laid out a really sketchy past. We all rejoiced that God delivered him from it, but at the same time, there was something joyous about the fact that he had shared all this because it created space for the rest of us to be open and honest about our struggles, about our doubts, about our failures. When one person allows themselves to be known and people see that they're not rejected, then others have space to also be known. And we create a kind of community where we can be together, where we can express our difficulties and be honest with each other without fear of being rejected. I want to come across as smart and funny and capable. And so it's easy for me to create an image that accentuates these qualities that I like and tries to de-emphasize the places that are less, in line with the image that I want to create. And so I create a stylized impression of who I am, a mask. It's designed to keep me safe, but it also keeps others out. And I think we all either do this or are tempted to do this. When we lay down our need to be impressive, only then can we be known and accepted. And if we don't, we live our lives in fear of being discovered and rejected. If we allow Jesus' humbling power, follow Jesus' example in humbling himself, then we can experience joy and belonging and security and healing, and it frees up God to work through us in power. After all, if my mission in life is to make myself look good, if God does something powerful through me, I'm going to try and take the credit. But if I'm the kind of person who doesn't have anything to prove, who can be open and honest about my struggles and my difficulties and my challenges and my failures, then when God does something powerful through me, God receives the glory, not me. And so God can breathe new life into the community where we walk in humility. But we have to want it. And we have to be willing to follow Jesus' example of not needing people to admire us. And so we end up having to make a choice. It's the same choice that the wise men have to make when they encounter this humble king. How low am I willing to go? Am I willing to bow down low enough to worship this humble king? Because if I'm not, my only alternative is to get back on my camel and ride back where I came from and pretend like I have never encountered the humble king.